This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast, giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silenced them. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 115, Ronnie Paris. As an infant suffering malnutrition and broken bones, Ronnie Paris was removed from his teenage parents' custody and placed into a wonderful foster home. After 2 years of nurturing and love, he was returned to his parents, and just 6 weeks later, 3-year-old Ronnie was dead, the victim of chronic, vicious abuse at the hands of his father. This is the story of a religious man who feared his toddler son might be gay and instigated a campaign of violence against the tiny boy, saying he didn't want Ronnie to grow up to be a sissy. It's also the story of a beautiful little boy with big brown eyes, an infectious smile, and a bright, limitless future, until Florida DCF reunited him with his abusive, neglectful parents. This is the infuriating story of Ronnie Paris. First up, I'd like to thank my newest patrons, Courtney T. from Westminster, Colorado, and an anonymous but very much appreciated friend from Ogdensburg, New Jersey. Thank you both so much for your support. If anyone else would like to make a contribution and help keep the show going, you can visit patreon.com/stlcpod. Today's episode continues June's theme of LGBTQ+ children and youth, or kids murdered by caregivers who made assumptions about their sexual orientation or gender identity. Last week's episode brought about a lot more criticism than I anticipated. I guess I had blocked out of my mind how bigoted some people can be. I got quite a few comments from people unhappy with my so-called preaching about treating trans people with respect, and to those people I say, if you're offended by my somehow controversial stance that trans people, like my own son, deserve to be treated with kindness, dignity, and respect, this probably isn't the podcast for you. Anyway, back to today's case. Ronnie's story isn't going to be easy for me to tell by any means, let alone for you to hear, but this innocent little boy deserves to have his story told and to be remembered. On that note, here we go. I think we can all agree that organized religion hasn't always had the most accepting of attitudes toward homosexuality. Many religions reject any sexual orientation other than heterosexual, although the level of opposition varies from religion to religion. Some denominations discourage homosexual behavior. Others forbid it while actively condemning social acceptance of same-sex activity. The most fundamental of religions can be openly homophobic, physically hostile toward those on the LGBTQ+ spectrum, and even supportive of criminalizing same-sex activity to the point of capital punishment. Certainly, there are religions that are in no way homophobic and openly accept those who identify anywhere along the LGBTQ+ spectrum. Unfortunately, those much more open-minded religious groups aren't generally the ones who make the headlines. For example, the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas, and its disgusting devotees have long been known for their anti-homosexual rhetoric, among many other reprehensible attitudes and actions. More than a religion, however, this particular church is actually a hate group, well known for its loud and garish protests at the funerals of gay murder victims and military veterans. They even traveled to picket the funerals of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting victims. You can imagine how I feel about this particular group. Fortunately, as of 2016, the WBC had only about 70 members, down from 80 in 2011. That's not the only church to find itself in the headlines for all the wrong reasons, however. The clip I'm about to play for you is part of a sermon by Pastor Sean Harris to his congregation at the Berean Baptist Church in Fayetteville, North Carolina in 2012. While preaching that marriage should be between a man and a woman, blah, 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 Pastor Harris said,
"Your little son starts to act a little girlish when he's 4 years old, and instead of squashing that like a cockroach and saying, 'Man up, son, get that dress off you and get outside and dig a ditch,' because that's what boys do, you get out the camera and you start taking pictures of Johnny acting like a female, and then you upload it to YouTube and everybody laughs about it, and next thing you know, this kid is acting out childhood fantasies that should have been squashed." Can I make it any clearer? Dads, the second you see your son dropping the limp wrist, you walk over there and crack that wrist. Man up. Give him a good punch. Okay? You're not going to act like that. You were made by God to be a male, and you're going to be a male. And when your daughter starts acting too butch, you rein her in. And you say, "Oh no. Oh no, sweetheart. You can play sports. Play them. Play them to the glory of God. But sometimes you're going to act like a girl and walk like a girl and talk like a girl and smell like a girl. And that means you're going to be beautiful. You're going to be attractive. You're going to dress yourself up." You say, "Can I take charge like that as a parent?" Yeah, you can. You're authorized. I just gave you a special dispensation this morning to do that.
I swear, the first time I heard that clip, my jaw stayed unhinged the entire time. After the clip went viral and created a national uproar that included death threats against Pastor Harris, this sham of a holy man went on CNN and apologized, sort of, trying to explain his comments. His apology was not for saying what he said, just for saying it how he did.
Give him a good punch.
Sure.
Squash like a cockroach. Crack that wrist.
Right.
What exactly were you telling your congregation to do here?
I was telling them in strong words that we're not careful. What did I learn this week? Be more careful with your words.
What would you have said differently?
I would say straighten. That's one thing I would say. Straighten that wrist.
What about the punch remark?
Sure, the punch remark. It's amazing how punch has been equated to inciting violence against gay youth. That's not what I meant.
When you said give him a good punch, what exactly did you mean?
A shove, an affirmation. You see coaches give their players a good punch, a good slug. It's a way of affirming the gender distinctions between a male and a female. I was apologizing for my failure to say the right thing, to be more careful, to make sure that no one thinks that Sean Harris is suggesting, as was said, although I never said this, beat the gay out of children. Those weren't my words. I didn't even use that. I don't even believe there are such things as gay children. So I wasn't saying that. I was dealing with effeminate behavior and instructing parents to affirm the manhood or the womanhood in their children.
Is there anything else that you'd like to apologize for?
No, I don't think that I need to apologize for preaching to my people what the Word of God says. That's my responsibility.
There was laughter in the congregation.
That's right.
I heard a few amens on that recording.
Yeah, because they knew what I meant. David, they knew that I wasn't advocating violence against gays, lesbians, youth.
During his half-assed apology tour, Pastor Harris told the Fayetteville Observer newspaper, "If I had to say it again, I would say it differently, no doubt. Those weren't planned words, but what I do stand by is that the Word of God makes it clear that effeminate behavior is ungodly. I'm not going to compromise on that." In a written statement, he said, "I do not apologize for the manner in which the Word of God articulates sexual immorality, including homosexuality and effeminacy, as a behavior that is an abomination of God." Ugh, I feel dirty just reading those words. In case you're thinking this guy is an anomaly, which is what I was hoping during my research for this episode, just type anti-gay pastor into YouTube or Google, and you'll see there's no shortage of results. And more than one of those results reveals so-called men of God apparently advocating for violence toward gays. Please understand, I'm absolutely not bashing religion in its entirety. I will say that in my opinion, most archaic religious views about homosexuality being wrong are based on flawed interpretations of the Bible as well as fear of the unknown. Homosexual behavior has been documented in nature in over 450 species of animals, especially social birds and mammals, in particular sea mammals and primates. Humans, however, are the only species who kill each other because of it. Imagine our audacity to think we're the most highly evolved species. The church little Ronnie Paris's parents attended was Deeper Life Christian Church in Tampa, Florida, which, in addition to being a church, also provides housing for hundreds of homeless people. It's also been plagued over the years with legal issues, accusations of financial impropriety, criminal charges, whispers from ex-members about taking advantage of the vulnerable, and even rumors of being a cult. Now, off the topic of religion, there have been studies, although they're limited in number and in scope, that seem to indicate that some signs of future sexual orientation may be present when a child is as young as 3.5 years old. In particular, when data from the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children was examined by psychologists at the UK's University of Cambridge, it suggested that whether children engage in non-gender conforming play as opposed to what some call male-typical or female-typical play may point toward the child's future sexual orientation. Male-typical play, as defined by the study, included playing with toy trucks, rough-and-tumble games like wrestling, and playing with other boys, while female typical play included things like dolls, playing house, and playing with other girls. I don't know specifically what behaviors may have caused the father in today's story to think his 3-year-old son was gay, or if it was just his overactive imagination, but I do know that little Ronnie was abused in his infancy, and no studies have indicated the child's future sexuality can be predicted that early. I'll be right back after a quick word from my sponsors. Stress is the most common cause of tooth grinding and day clenching. Some of the stories I tell on this podcast are incredibly stressful, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to hear that after listening, some of you find yourself clenching your jaw or grinding your teeth in your sleep. Clenching and grinding leads to erosion of the tooth enamel, can cause cracked or chipped teeth, makes you susceptible to heightened tooth sensitivity, and may even result in infection. Once you lose that enamel, it doesn't grow back. It's gone forever. Fixing these dental problems can be super expensive. Crowns can cost anywhere from $800 to $3,000 per tooth. Veneers can run $400 to $2,500 for each tooth, and replacing your whole mouthful of teeth with implants can set you back anywhere from $7,000 to $90,000. The better option is prevention, right? Dentists offer night guards to protect your teeth, but they can cost anywhere between $225 and $600, not even counting the dental visit. Smile Brilliant, on the other hand, creates custom night guards for as low as $45 per guard. Depending on the package you purchase, reorders can be as low as $25 per guard. Smile Brilliant keeps a digital file of your dental impressions, making reorders at smilebrilliant.com absolutely hassle-free. You can visit smilebrilliant.com and use my promo code CHILDREN for 20% off your custom night guard. That's smilebrilliant.com, promo code CHILDREN. While you're there, you can also shop for custom-fitted teeth whitening trays, whitening gel, electric toothbrushes, water flossers, and much more. By supporting Smile Brilliant, you're also supporting the show. That's smilebrilliant.com, promo code CHILDREN. Ronnie Antonio Paris was born on December 9, 2001, to mother Nishira Kiara Paris, who was 17, and father Ronnie Bernard Paris Jr., who was 18 and shared his own father's first and middle names. For the sake of clarity, I'll call the baby Ronnie, his grandfather Ronald Sr., and his father Ronnie Jr. Soon after his birth, little Ronnie and his mother, Nishira, who was born in New Jersey on October 23, 1984, lived at Deeper Life Church in Tampa. As I mentioned earlier, the church provided shelter for a large number of people without homes. When Ronnie was about 2 months old, someone called Florida's state child abuse hotline and reported that although Ronnie had been vomiting for more than 24 hours, his mother wasn't seeking medical treatment for him. Ronnie was admitted to the hospital, where medical staff determined that his vomiting was likely the result of Nishira overfeeding him, and he was released into her care with a recommendation to give him an electrolyte drink called Pedialyte to avoid dehydration. Within 2 months, by April of 2002, Ronnie began suffering vomiting spells again, as well as dehydration. This time because of the mother's failure to follow medical advice, including Nishira's failure to seek treatment for Ronnie or give him Pedialyte. The baby was removed from his mother's custody and placed into the home of his paternal grandparents, Ronald Sr. and Cheryl Paris, where his father, Ronnie Jr., also lived. Around this time, Ronnie Jr., who was born on July 18, 1983, and was nearly 19, began working as a wastewater worker in the city of Tampa. A month later, in May of 2002, 5-month-old Ronnie was admitted to the hospital yet again after he began losing weight. Doctors found the baby suffered from failure to thrive and was noticeably undernourished, and X-rays revealed fractures in Ronnie's arm and leg that had apparently been inflicted about 3 weeks before and had begun healing. A police report about the incident stated, "The injuries are clearly non-accidental." However, because of the timing of the injuries and the number of people who had been around the baby during that time frame, police were unable to determine who had actually inflicted baby Ronnie's injuries. Detective Donna Keene wrote in the report, "There has to be grave concern for his welfare if he is returned to either parent without knowing who caused these injuries." A medical summary cited in an abuse report from the Florida Department of Children and Families, or DCF, stated, "This child clearly has been neglected and abused. This baby is in danger of continuous abuse/neglect, or worse if he remains in this home setting." The statement was based on 3 danger signs: Ronnie's episodes of losing weight, unusual hemorrhaging in his eyes, and his broken bones. The DCF investigation deemed it verified that Ronnie's parents had neglected his medical care. However, in spite of his arm and leg fractures, the report only found some indicators of physical abuse, which wasn't as definitive a finding as verified. Some indicators meant DCF also could not identify who inflicted the broken limbs. A judge ordered the baby removed from his grandparents' home and placed into foster care. Wearing an arm cast, Ronnie was placed in the home of 44-year-old Faye Bing. Faye lived in Bradenton, Florida, with her husband, Bobby, and their 2 daughters, Katrina, who was about 14 at the time, and Kelsey, who was around 9. The family adored little Ronnie, who they affectionately called Bubba, and treated like a member of their own family, considering him like a brother to the 2 girls. In the Bing home, Ronnie began thriving. Faye later described the little boy, who she would have been willing to adopt as her own, as always laughing and playing. He even taught another, younger foster child in the home to walk. During the time Ronnie lived with the Bing family, Ronnie Jr. and Nishira visited him in the Bing home as per their agreement with DCF. During these visits, Nishira dutifully followed the baby around the house, while Ronnie Jr. sat on the couch, not talking much and seeming markedly less invested in parenting than his young wife was. As a side note, Ronnie Jr. apparently had a really hard time following rules, or at least the rules of the road. During the time period in which his son was removed from their home, his record is full of driving infractions. In February of 2003, he was charged with driving with a suspended license without knowledge, a civil offense in Florida. He was charged in November of the same year with operating an unsafe or uninspected vehicle. In January of 2004, he was charged with having no valid driver's license. The following month, he was charged again with driving with a suspended license, this time with knowledge, and a few days later, he was hit with 2 more charges: failure to carry or display his driver's license, and operating an unsafe or uninspected vehicle again. That June, he received yet another charge of driving with a suspended license without knowledge. In order to regain custody of their son, the young couple was told to complete a case plan, like all parents would be required to do in their situation. Their specific case plan was comprised of 6 steps. 1. Stay in touch with DCF. 2. Find and maintain stable housing. 3. Become and remain financially stable. 4. Attend parenting classes. 5. Visit Ronnie regularly in foster care. And 6. Attend a nutrition class. Forebodingly, the case plan did not address the violence that led to Ronnie's 2 broken bones, which it should have, according to later comments from DCF spokesman Andy Ritter, who said, "A case plan should be put into place that specifically addresses activities that will remediate the chances of reoccurrence." During one court hearing during this time, Ronnie Jr., who had completed a parenting class, said, "It's a good, excellent program, don't get me wrong, But my son, he's 2 years old. They're just basically teaching boys from other ages, like 6 or on up. I want more information on how to take care of my son and his needs. Caseworkers said in court that Nishira seemed overwhelmed with the parenting class, and she did have difficulty with it, but she ultimately finished the class in late 2004. Caseworker Linda Miller said during a court hearing in December of 2004 that Nishira had both completed her parenting class and learned more about how to respond to Ronnie's medical symptoms. So now we're ready to take the option for reunification. I've started them with 1 night unsupervised visitation. I did the home study on Monday. The home is appropriate. They have everything they need for the baby. In court hearings in January, June, and December of 2004, not once did the issue of Ronnie's inflicted bone fractures during infancy come up, and DCF caseworkers deemed Ronnie was a low risk of harm from reunification with his parents. As a result of the completion of at least most of the case plan, and Ronnie being determined low risk, Hillsborough Circuit Judge Kevin Carey ordered Ronnie returned to his biological parents in December of 2004. Within 6 weeks, he would be dead. Less than a week after his 3rd birthday, Ronnie was returned to his parents on December 14, 2004, under the supervision of Hillsborough Kids Incorporated, a nonprofit organization that contracted with the Department of Children and Families to provide foster care and child welfare services. Ronnie was never assigned a guardian ad litem, or GAL, which, surprisingly, were only appointed in about 35% of cases in the Hillsborough County child welfare system. GALs basically advocate for these children, examining the child's case and reporting their findings to the court. Once Ronnie returned to his parents' home in Apartment D at 913 East Humphrey Street in Tampa, the abuse picked up right where it left off when he was an infant. Ronnie Jr. told his wife and others that he was afraid his son would grow up to be gay, so he resolved to toughen the little boy up by slap boxing with him, which he would do until little Ronnie sobbed. Ronnie Jr. batted his son around, punching him in the head whenever the mood struck, all because he didn't want his son growing up to be, in his words, a sissy. Upstairs neighbor Taya Davenport later reported hearing frequent fights between Ronnie Jr. and Nishira that involved shouting, banging on doors, and objects thrown against walls. Foster mother Faye Bing was so attached to Ronnie that she visited him regularly, driving up from Bradenton to Tampa to see him 3 times between mid-December of 2004 and January of 2005. During these highly concerning visits, Faye later said, the little boy she called Bubba would cry in her arms, but he wouldn't speak a word, although he had been chatty in her home. He looked like he had lost weight, and during a visit in early January, she noticed what appeared to be a burn mark on Ronnie's forehead and a bruise on his cheek. Troubled by what she saw, Faye pointed out Ronnie's injuries and the changes in his behavior to his caseworker, who shrugged off her concerns, choosing instead to believe Nishira's explanation that Ronnie incurred the injuries in a fall. On January 13, 2005, Faye returned to Tampa for another visit, this time bringing along her sister, Tammy McAdams, also of Bradenton. Prior to that visit, Tammy thought Faye might have been exaggerating about Ronnie's condition, but when she laid eyes on the little boy she too had grown to love, Tammy understood how serious the situation was. She later described Ronnie, saying, "He wasn't nothing but head. All his weight was gone." Just 3 days prior to that visit, Ronnie had been released from the hospital, where he had been admitted for an unspecified illness involving more vomiting spells. Though no longer hospitalized, Ronnie was still sick. Nishira allowed Faye and Tammy to take the little boy for a ride, and he threw up in Faye's vehicle. Faye later said that Ronnie never threw up while he lived in her home. During that ride, Tammy suggested that Faye turn the vehicle south and take Ronnie home to Bradenton with them, but they both knew that would end in disaster. Ronnie's parents would call the police, no one would believe what they had to say, and Faye's other foster child, and possibly her biological children, would be taken from her home. After the January 13th visit, Faye didn't call the police or the state's child abuse hotline, though she later bitterly regretted not doing so. She had reported her suspicions to Ronnie's caseworker, who was supposed to call any reports into the hotline herself, but, unbeknownst to Faye, failed to do so. On January 21, 2005, Ronnie received a savage beating at the hands of his father, after which he became lethargic, stopped eating, and began wetting himself, all of which were indicative of a serious brain injury. Still, his parents neglected to seek medical treatment. Instead, the following day, they took Ronnie with them to a friend's house, where they attended a Deeper Life Ministries Bible study, leaving Ronnie to fall asleep on the friend's couch. During the meeting, Nishira noticed something was wrong. Her 3-year-old son was not just sleeping, he was unconscious, and he was not breathing. Upon this realization, they finally decided to take Ronnie to the hospital. Along the way, they saw a police officer and stopped to ask for help. The officer attempted CPR, and so did paramedics, but Ronnie remained unresponsive and in cardiac arrest, so he was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital in Tampa. At the hospital, doctors found swelling on both sides of Ronnie's brain. Because he was unable to breathe on his own, he was placed on life support. 6 days later, life support was withdrawn, and on Friday, January 28, 2005, Ronnie Antonio Paris died at just 3 years and 7 weeks old. An autopsy conducted 2 days later determined that Ronnie's death was a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to the back of the head, which the medical examiner deemed to be intentionally inflicted. It wasn't until Nishira Paris was interviewed by police on February 1, 2005, that she made the first mention of what had truly taken place inside their East Humphrey Street apartment in the days leading up to Ronnie's death. She told investigators that on January 21st, she saw Ronnie Jr. punch their 3-year-old son in the head multiple times, as well as pick up the victim and slam the back of his head against the wall. It wasn't the first time her husband had abused Ronnie either. He frequently hit the little boy, going as far as to punch Ronnie in the head while Nishira clutched her son to her shoulder, trying to protect him. Once, her husband even threw Ronnie at his mother. According to police spokeswoman Laura McElroy, Nishira's account of the final beating was consistent with the autopsy report and the bruises found on Ronnie's head. Only after Nishira spilled her guts to the police were arrest warrants issued. Ronnie Bernard Paris Jr. was arrested and charged with felony murder and aggravated child abuse in connection with the beating death of his son. Nishira Kiara Paris was taken into custody on a charge of child neglect for failing to get the medical assistance her son needed to survive. Both were booked into the Hillsborough County Jail. And now a word from my sponsors. When interviewed by the Tampa Bay Times at her Bradenton home on Tuesday, February 1, 2005, Faye Bing, with her sister Tammy McAdams present, held a tissue near her face and repeatedly slapped a chair in disbelief and frustration. Faye told the reporter of sharing her concerns about Ronnie being abused with his caseworker, pointing out his injuries after she visited him at his parents' apartment. As she listened to the details of Ronnie's abuse and murder as recounted on the news, Faye took his framed photo off the living room wall, cradled it, and began weeping, crying out, "Bubba, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." During the interview, Faye flipped through a scrapbook containing photos of Ronnie. When the local news flashed a picture of his face, she threw herself against the TV, sobbing, "He didn't have to do that. If he didn't want him, let me take him back." After Ronnie's murder, Florida DCF faced public scrutiny and scorn for their failure to identify Ronnie's abuse and neglect. The week Ronnie died, the executive director of Hillsborough Kids, Chris Card, quit abruptly, and subsequently a state investigation criticized his handling of various administrative and financial matters. The nonprofit Child Welfare Agency was also forced to explain how another child under its supervision died in Alabama. That child was 4-month-old Phoenix Jordan Parrish, who was removed from his mother and father 24 hours after his birth in 2004. The baby was taken, evidently, because his parents, Tiara Gobble and Samuel Hunter, were accused of being abusive, presumably to his older sister. The baby, who the family called Cody, and his sister were taken in by their great-uncle, Edgar Parrish, who agreed he would not let Tiara and Samuel have access to their children. It seems Edgar soon changed his mind, going as far as to move out of Florida to Alabama with Cody's parents, who he allowed to live in his trailer with himself and the children. Not long afterward, Cody's crying became too much for his mother, Tiara, who slammed the baby's head against the side of his crib. Cody was rushed to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead at just 4 months old on December 15, 2004. Baby Cody, who was covered in bruises, had also suffered broken ribs, broken wrists, and a skull fracture. Cody's Hillsborough Kids caseworker, Carrie Felton, later claimed he tried for weeks to get in touch with Tiara with no success. That did no one any good, however, because he failed to report that he could not contact or find the family. Mr. Felton also lied and said he had been seeing the children at their current home at least once a month, which wasn't true because if he had, he would have learned that the parents had moved in with Edgar and had access to Cody and his sister. The caseworker was fired after the fact. Tiara Capri Gobble was ultimately convicted of her son's murder and sentenced to death. 17 years later, she's still sitting on Alabama's death row. Cody's father, Samuel Davis Hunter, pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and great-uncle Edgar Parrish was convicted of aggravated child abuse. Both received sentences of 10 years in prison and have since been released. After Ronnie's death, DCF spokesman in Tampa, Andrew Ritter, said, "How a parent could allegedly murder a child is unimaginable and heartbreaking to every parent. The department will thoroughly review the circumstances surrounding the death and work with all parties to ensure the safety of all children." When asked if Ronnie's caseworkers missed warning signs, Ritter said, "There was a very short period of time from the reunification of Ronnie to his unfortunate death. However, in that short time, the case manager documented events that should have raised concerns regarding the child's care." Of course, he was referring to the marks on Ronnie's face, which Nishira at one point told the caseworker were there when Ronnie was returned to them. Faye Bing adamantly denied that. It was documented that on January 5th, after visiting Ronnie at his parents' apartment, Faye told Linda Miller, "I have some concerns. The mark on Ronnie's forehead, it looks like a burn to me." At least 2 of Ronnie's injuries should have been reported to the state's abuse hotline, according to the DCF report, which also mentions that doctors who treated Ronnie for a variety of reasons during the 6 weeks he lived with his parents did not see signs of abuse. DCF Chief of Staff Bill Spann called Ronnie's death a tragic case that would be thoroughly and completely investigated with the full cooperation of the agency, adding, "It's incomprehensible to any parent, particularly to those who are in the business of caring for Florida's vulnerable children, that any parent could allegedly harm their child." Interim Hillsborough Kids Executive Director Jeff Rainey, who eventually settled into the role on a permanent basis, said he had begun an extensive review of other cases under his agency's care to make sure there were no similar problems. "I don't know that you can put your hand on one thing. There was some systemic breakdown. There was a lack of communication and, just unfortunately, for whatever reason, it ended up in a tragic event." What it boils down to is that Ronnie should never have been returned to his parents. While they may have completed their case plan, caseworkers are supposed to make sure parents can support their children in a healthy home. Completely opposite to that goal, in July of 2004, Nishira and Ronnie Jr. were sued for failing to pay their $550 per month rent on an apartment at 12711 North 58th Street in Temple Terrace. They lost a default judgment in August, 4 months before winning the right to get Ronnie back. Also, remember all of Ronnie Jr.'s driving offenses during that time period? When added to the totality of the case, none of that adds up to stability either. In March of 2005, a preliminary review report from DCF criticized Linda Miller, Ronnie's most recent caseworker, for her apparent inability to recognize signs of abuse and neglect that likely contributed to Ronnie's death, despite the fact that she had access to 3 years' worth of records in his case. The DCF review revealed that 5 times after he was reunited with his parents, caseworkers saw bruises, a scratch, and a possible burn on his cheeks and forehead. They also noted that he was repeatedly vomiting and regressing in his speech and toilet training, all of which should be highly concerning for abuse. Another point of criticism within the report was that Nishira and Ronnie Jr. weren't given psychological evaluations, even though medical professionals had recommended that at least Nishira be evaluated. They also never attended Positive Parenting, a recommended basic parenting skills program. Despite Ronnie's inflicted injuries prior to being put into foster care, his parents weren't sent to anger management or referred to other services specifically designed for people who may be violent. Because of his history with the broken bones in his infancy, Ronnie's caseworkers should have seen the danger these new injuries signaled. Instead, they rated his situation low risk and allowed him to be returned to his parents. The risk should have been rated as high, according to the report, based on the history of a serious injury with no identified perpetrator, the length of time the child had been out of the home, the age of the child, and the inexperience of this young couple in child rearing. The inability of the care manager to identify similarities between the original reasons that the child was placed in care in 2002 and the recurring health issues after reunification contributed to the failure to protect this child. If the care manager had recognized the warning signs, actions to protect this child could have prevented his death. Caseworker Linda Miller was suspended without pay, and her supervisor, Dorcas Walker, was suspended with pay from their jobs at Northside Mental Health Center, a partner with Hillsborough Kids in working with foster children under the contract with DCF. Ms. Miller had worked for Northside since 2002 and received meets expectations or exceeds expectations on her recent employee evaluations. Marsha Lewis Brown, executive director of Northside, said, "The staff person who worked with this case and this family, based upon some of the comments in the report, failed to collectively put together the dots to be able to see this case completely. There are some very positive things that she did in terms of being responsive to the family, but the bottom line of all of this was there was the child's father who killed the child." The murder trial of Ronnie Bernard Paris Jr. began on Monday, July 11, 2005. During the trial, the prosecution's witnesses portrayed Ronnie Jr. as a man who openly questioned whether Ronnie was his. They also testified that he had a bad temper, becoming angry whenever Ronnie was ill, which was often when he was in his parents' care. The defense tried to shift the blame to Nishira, saying her account of the fatal incident was an attempt to save herself. Defense attorney Ken Littman pointed out the conflicting accounts Nishira gave about the abuse and questioned her reasoning for withholding the truth from investigators until February 1st. Nishira, by then age 20, testified on day one of the trial, saying she didn't remember much about the 6 weeks she spent with her son. She told the court that her husband was jealous of Ronnie because, since he was returned to the couple, they didn't have enough sex for his liking. She testified that Ronnie Jr. told her not to hug their son because he thought it might make the boy grow up to be homosexual. According to Nishira, her husband was trying to toughen up their son because he was worried he would grow up to be gay, and he didn't want him to grow up soft. That was how his father raised him, Ronnie Jr. insisted, so it must be the right way to raise a boy to be straight. Ronnie Jr., Nishira testified, would slap and pummel their son in the head until the 3-year-old cried so he wouldn't grow up a sissy. She witnessed Ronnie Jr. being rough with Ronnie several times, but she didn't take him to the hospital immediately. Throughout those 6 weeks, her son was in and out of the hospital, suffering from dehydration and vomiting spells. Nishira told the court that finally, on January 21st, Ronnie came in the kitchen. He was upset and he slammed the baby up against the wall. The next day, on January 22nd, she said, their son was acting strangely. He was lethargic and wouldn't eat. Nonetheless, they went to a friend's house for Bible study, where Ronnie spent most of the day sleeping on the couch. They had just ordered pizza for dinner, Nishira said, when she noticed there was something wrong with Ronnie. We was quoting scriptures and stuff, and I looked over at my baby and saw he wasn't breathing. Her husband picked up their son, who was in cardiac arrest, and loaded him into the truck to begin the rush towards St. Joseph's Hospital. Nishira said she was so fearful that someone would take her baby away again that despite her husband's ongoing abuse of Ronnie, she never called police or her caseworker to report it, even after Ronnie became unresponsive. After he was admitted to the hospital for the last time, she didn't tell police right away what happened because she didn't want to get her husband in trouble. Also, she'd just gotten Ronnie back, and she didn't want to lose him again. I was scared I'd get my baby took away from me. I just didn't want my baby to get taken away from me. I thought he was going to make it. Ronnie Jr.'s defense attorney, Assistant Public Defender Ken Littman, asked Nishira why she didn't report the abuse. You thought that the cops were going to put this on you if you didn't say anything? Nishira responded, yes. Her testimony was corroborated by her sister, Shanita Powell, who had seen the abuse for herself. He was trying to teach him how to fight. He was afraid the child might be gay. Family friend Sheldon Bostick, who attended Bible study with the family, testified that he, too, had seen the abuse. He had told Ronnie Jr. several times not to play so rough with the toddler, but the man replied that this was how his own father taught him how to take a punch. Sheldon testified, He really did what other fathers do, slapbox. He always said he didn't want his son growing up to be pushed around. Assistant State's Attorney Jalal Harb asked, "Did Ronnie use a term for that?" Sheldon replied, "He didn't want him to be a sissy." Outside the courtroom, Ronnie Jr.'s childhood friend Jim Shea spoke to a reporter, expressing doubts about the murder charges, saying Ronnie Jr. had been frustrated about being the sole breadwinner in the house. In his opinion, his friend may have been too young to be a father, but he would never have killed his son. "I never saw him act wild. If anything, they should both be charged." On Tuesday, July 12, 2005, pediatrician Dr. John Hafner testified that he examined Ronnie when he arrived at the hospital on January 22nd, and he noticed that the boy was exceptionally skinny. Tests showed he had sustained 2 serious head injuries sometime before becoming unconscious and then unresponsive. "I noted in my notes that the injury was suspicious." Detective Anthony Zambito said on the stand that he was immediately suspicious about Ronnie's death, and it wasn't until investigators questioned them separately on February 1st that Nishira spoke up about the abuse. The detective testified that Nishira told them it started with play fighting as a means to prevent the little boy from growing up to be gay. Shortly after Ronnie returned home from foster care, his dad smacked him 3 times on the back of the head, and even though she told him to stop, he continued. During one incident, she said she got out of the shower and found Ronnie crying after another beating. "He kept hitting him in the back of the head. He said that the baby jumped at him." Detective Zambito said Nishira had told investigators that her husband repeatedly abused the child, slapping him in the back of the head, slamming him into walls, and forcing the child to participate in father-son boxing matches until the boy began to shake, cry, and wet himself. On the final day of testimony, which was Wednesday, July 13, 2005, Hillsborough County Associate Medical Examiner Dr. Sam Galino gave graphic testimony about Ronnie's autopsy. The pathologist noted Ronnie's scarred face and bruised head, saying there were signs of abuse all over his body. He had also suffered microscopic tears in his brain, as well as subsurface bruises between his skull and scalp. "It's my opinion that the injuries that caused the hospitalization on January 22nd and eventually his death occurred as a result of blunt head trauma." The doctor testified that there were no outward signs of Ronnie's fatal head injury, but further examination showed that he had suffered 3 severe blows that resulted in internal bruising and trauma to the brain. In addition, the pathologist's review of Ronnie's medical records revealed that it wasn't the first time Ronnie had been abused. When reviewing the incident in May of 2002, when Ronnie's arm and leg were broken, the doctor found that his father said the injuries probably happened when he rolled over onto the baby in bed, but the pathologist doubted this version of events, saying the fractures were consistent with abusive trauma. "I would presume they are non-accidental or inflicted." He also said that Ronnie's vomiting and lethargy the day before his final hospitalization was likely a sign of the severe head trauma he had suffered. Ronnie's foster mother, Faye Bing, testified that Ronnie never vomited while in her care, and he had a healthy appetite, which was a stark contrast to his lack of appetite after he was returned to his parents. Fighting tears, Faye could barely talk about visiting Ronnie 3 weeks before his death. Faye's sister, Tammy McAdams, also took the stand, echoing her sister's testimony that during the 2 years Ronnie lived with the Bings, he never vomited and had a good appetite. The same day, defense attorney Ken Littman filed a motion to reduce his client's charges, saying prosecutors had failed to show that Ronnie Jr. intended to harm his son. Asking Hillsborough Circuit Judge Barbara Fleischer to consider reducing the murder and aggravated child abuse charges to lesser offenses, Mr. Littman said, "There is no evidence that he inflicted great bodily harm intentionally." The judge denied the defense's motion. Ronnie Jr., wearing a borrowed suit, did not take the stand in his own defense. During closing arguments on July 13th, Mr. Littman said his client's rough play with his son didn't amount to homicide. "He wanted his son to be strong and tough. That doesn't make him a killer." Trying to pin the blame on Nishira, the defense pointed out that she didn't call the police or her caseworker after any of the beatings she witnessed, and in fact, she didn't mention the abuse to the police until February 1st. After only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Ronnie Bernard Paris Jr. guilty of second-degree manslaughter and aggravated child abuse. When the verdict was read, he didn't even flinch, even though his conviction meant he could face life in prison. After the trial, Ronald Paris Sr., Ronnie's grandfather, polished off a bag of Cheetos while he spoke to a reporter from the Tampa Tribune, saying, "Oh man, I raised my son in the right way. We played football, went fishing, went to wrestling matches, boxing, all that." Instead of accepting any kind of responsibility on his son's part, Ronald Sr. blamed Nishira, saying she had lied. Whatever she said, her mind was not right. Ronnie Jr.'s grandmother, Leslie Hooks, said, "He shouldn't have married her. We told him she wasn't right. Ronnie ain't never did nothing bad. But you know how the devil is. He takes the good ones." I'll be right back after a quick sponsor break. Ronnie Jr.'s sentencing hearing took place on Friday, August 19, 2005. When given the opportunity to speak, the former city sewer worker begged for leniency and apologized, telling the judge, "I loved my son dearly. I never did anything to hurt my baby or abuse my baby in any way. I'm scared for my life to go to prison. I miss my baby. I wish I could get him back. I tried to work hard as best I could to be a father for my son." His family and friends backed him up during their statements, saying Ronnie Jr. wasn't the violent type. His mother, Cheryl Paris, cried as she pleaded for a lighter sentence for the son she said she raised to be respectful. "I know my son, and I don't think he would do this to his child." Foster aunt Tammy McAdams took issue with the glowing testimony by Ronnie Jr.'s family, saying to the court, "So if he was such a good father, then whatever happened could have been prevented because it didn't happen all in one day." Faye Bing said she wished she had done more to keep Ronnie, who she called Bubba, from being returned to his parents. She wept as she asked the judge to impose the maximum penalty, saying directly to Ronnie Jr., "What did little Bubba do to die so young?" Hillsborough Circuit Judge Barbara Fleischer, who said she had trouble sleeping the night before the sentencing, said she didn't think Ronnie Jr. was an evil man, but she also didn't think he was remorseful. "I think that for a father to kill his own child is an unforgivable act." However, the judge said she had decided against life in prison, in part because Ronnie Jr. was a first-time offender who she felt needed help. With that, she sentenced Ronnie Jr. to 30 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. His probation provisions stipulated that after his release from prison, Ronnie Jr. must attend and complete anger management and a parenting class, and he must undergo a psychological evaluation and treatment if necessary before having contact with any child. Nishira still faced up to 15 years in prison for her charge of child neglect, to which she initially pleaded not guilty. After Ronnie Jr.'s trial, Nishira underwent a psychiatric evaluation and was deemed competent to stand trial. In October of 2005, she withdrew her not guilty plea and entered an open plea of no contest, also known as a straight-up plea, otherwise known as throwing oneself on the mercy of the court. On January 9, 2006, Judge Anthony K. Black sentenced Nishira Paris to 5 years probation, with the provisions added that she would obtain her GED and maintain employment of 40 hours per week. After he was sentenced, Ronnie Jr. appealed to the Florida 2nd District Court of Appeal, which affirmed his conviction and sentence in August of 2006. He subsequently filed 2 separate motions for post-conviction relief, both of which were denied. In September of 2011, he filed his federal habeas corpus petition on 2 separate grounds, both involving ineffective assistance of counsel, but his petition was also denied. In January of 2012, the Florida Department of Children and Families opted not to renew its $65 million contract with Hillsborough Kids Incorporated, instead contracting with Eckerd Youth Alternatives. In June of the same year, Hillsborough Kids permanently closed its doors, transferring the cases of the roughly 2,800 Florida children in its care to EYA. Ronnie's death inspired the creation of 3 notable works. Tennessee artist James McKissick created a painting in Ronnie's memory called Little Soul Up to Heaven for Ronnie Paris. I've included a photo of the painting, as well as a photo of the artist, in the Facebook photo album for this episode. Author and poet Jabari Jawan Allen wrote a chilling, visceral short piece entitled Seed, based on Ronnie Jr.'s fatal attack on little Ronnie. I know I won't do it justice while reading it, but the piece, which was published in the summer 2018 issue of the Virginia Quarterly Review, reads as follows. This is a dance with daddies black boys know all too well. The blood-curdling cadence of Mad Dad's blows replaces splendid rim shot and boogie. Virile thwacks on little Ronnie's back scrawl raucous songs into the bastard night. Oh, he writhes and shimmies and bawls, but sobs will not shield this limp-wristed son from his papa's waltz. Only this time, father will jostle his bouncing baby boy just a little too hard, will fling the itsy-bitsy hindrance just a little too far. Morbid portraiture will occur between this dismal trinity of hardened father, bleary-eyed wife, and oblivious son. This will be Dad's last dance with his first and only born, baby boy's final kaboom. Big Ronnie releases a canned slap. The wall spits the hurled burden back, the way he bangs and bursts like a tiny tambourine tapped by some church sissy. But Big Ronnie is no church sissy, and his son won't be either. His son won't be anything but drooping effigy. The slumped thud of runt is the wrong kind of alive splayed here like Christ. And yet there is nothing sanctified about this scene, a mother turned Pieta at the sight of her lurched boy, her husband's only begotten clutter. The oops of her ovaries slackens, forced to forfeit the spring in his nimble spine. Naishira is not allowed to touch her struck progeny. Any indication of mothering could mean more trouble for the sport. She prays for a sign, a wink or anything from her bashed baby, but little Ronnie hasn't entered that spooky womb of death yet, so he jerks, shifts, slants, tilts. The teeny-weeny not God resurrects only for his reedy anatomy to catch up with its failing clockwork. He omens the comatose, his body a weary engine, sluggish at every second and wetting itself. Lethargic serum lulls the little one into an immutable slumber. He has fallen asleep forever in the red upholstery of a neighbor's couch during Bible study. Once the makeshift church has bid amen, Naishira attempts to wake her already vanished child from listless stupor. She nudges the little guy hard, but the boy is flimsy again. Lil Ronnie, come on, get up, please, baby. But there's no use. Little Ronnie is now a languid saint. There's no psyche in his spine that can be undone this time. There's just the dragging lax of unconsciousness. Big Ronnie scurries to his slack son, scooping the dizzied mystic into his arms, but it's far too late for delicacy. Little Ronnie's stoical doze is a habitual hide-and-seek from which there is no waking.
No matter how many times I read that piece, I get chills every time. Sadly, Ronnie's foster mom, Faye Bing, lost her husband Bobby earlier this year. They were married for 36 years and had 3 daughters together. Faye and Bobby's oldest daughter, Katrina, was the creator of the 3rd piece of art inspired by Ronnie's death. Katrina wrote a riveting novel based on her family's experience with fostering and losing Ronnie, published in 2019 and titled Forever 3. I'll include the book's Amazon link in the show notes. Ronnie Bernard Paris Jr., who is now 38 years old, is incarcerated in the Central Florida Reception Center, a men's prison in Orlando. He is scheduled for release on July 27, 2030. Now aged 37, Naishira, who goes by a different last name but still lives in Tampa, apparently completed her probation and has remained under the radar ever since. In the meantime, she now has 3 more sons, the first of whom came along within a year or 2 of her sentencing. The only public mention of her oldest son, Ronnie, that I could find on any of her 3 Facebook pages was in 2012, when another of her children was hospitalized, and she posted,
"My little boy just came from the hospital. I was so worried about him. I was up just about all night praying for him, thanking God for giving me another chance to be a mother. You never really think about life until something really bad happens. I know how it feels to lose a child. It's a hurt that if you've never lost a child, would never understand. It's a hurt that's out of this world, but I'm thankful that God brought my baby back to me safe and sound. My heart is forever grateful. Thank you, Jesus."
Rest in peace and power, Ronnie. You'll never be forgotten. My sources for this episode were The Advocate, the Lipstick Alley Forums, goodasyou.org, Wikipedia, Yale Scientific Magazine, Science.org, ABC News, the Chicago Tribune, 10 Tampa Bay, the Tampa Bay Times, the Tampa Tribune, the Herald Tribune, the Orlando Sentinel, the Lakeland Ledger, the St. Petersburg Times, Murderpedia, My Crime Library, Crime Magazine, the Tampa Bay Business Journal, Facebook, the Virginia Quarterly Review, the Apostle Funeral Home, the Hillsborough Online Viewing of Electronic Records website, and the Florida Department of Corrections website. That's it for this week. Join me next week for another episode.
If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio,
Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com, where you can listen to episodes or become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. Follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest at Suffer the Little Children Pod, and on Twitter and TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook and Instagram. For more stories like the one you heard today, visit sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Lane. All music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. Email tips, comments, questions, or case suggestions to sufferthelittlechildren.pod@gmail.com. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. If you see something, say something. Until next week, bye everyone.